Friedrich Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the small village of Röcken, in what was then the Prussian province of Saxony. His birth date was significant. It was the same day as the birthday of King Frederick William IV of Prussia, and so the boy was named Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche in his honor. Nietzsche's childhood began in a house deeply shaped by religion and discipline. His father, Carl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, and his family lived in the rectory close to the church. However, this idyllic image was shattered when tragedy struck early. His father developed a serious brain illness and died when Nietzsche was only 5 years old. Just a year later, his younger brother also passed away. These early experiences of loss, fragility, and mortality left lasting marks on Nietzsche's inner world. Raised afterward by his mother, Franziska, his sister, Elisabeth, and 2 aunts, Nietzsche grew up in what he would later describe as a house of women. Surrounded by strong yet pious female figures, he absorbed both discipline and a sense of moral duty, but he also felt confined by the expectations of faith. Despite grief and illness haunting his youth, Nietzsche displayed signs of extraordinary talent. By the time he entered school, teachers already noticed his sharp memory, his love of music, and his gift for language. He was not a loud or rebellious child. Instead, he was quiet, thoughtful, and introspective, often described as old beyond his years. The small boy from Röcken, growing up under the shadow of death and religion, would one day shake the foundations of both.
At the age of 14, Nietzsche entered Schulpforta, one of the most prestigious boarding schools in Germany. This was no ordinary school. It was a place of strict discipline, rigorous classical education, and intellectual training designed to shape future leaders of the Prussian state. Here, Nietzsche's talents blossomed. He immersed himself in Greek and Latin, reading Homer, Plato, and the tragedians in their original languages. Ancient Greece became a world he adored, a civilization that celebrated tragedy, beauty, and human greatness. The seeds of his later philosophy, with its constant return to Greek myths and heroes, were planted here. But Schulpforta was not just about academics. Nietzsche also developed a love for music and poetry. He began composing pieces, writing verses, and forming small circles of friends with whom he shared his intellectual passions. Even as a teenager, he seemed to stand apart, intense, serious, and always questioning. Despite excelling, Nietzsche never fully fit the mold of the obedient Prussian student. He was deeply reflective, often walking alone, and he started to show skepticism toward the strict religious upbringing he had inherited. His classmates nicknamed him the Little Pastor because of his serious demeanor, but inside, Nietzsche was already wrestling with doubts about faith and the meaning of life. By the time he graduated in 1864, he had become a brilliant classicist, fluent in ancient languages, with a profound admiration for Greek culture. But he also carried with him an inner tension between the strict morality of his upbringing and the burning desire to break free and discover truth for himself. The stage was set for Nietzsche's next step, the university, where his rebellious spirit would begin to take shape.
In 1864, Nietzsche enrolled at the University of Bonn, originally intending to study theology and classical philology. At first, he followed his family's hopes. Perhaps he would become a pastor like his father, but this path would not last long. Within just 1 semester, Nietzsche abandoned theology. His faith, already shaken, collapsed entirely. He declared himself no longer a Christian, a shocking break from his family's expectations.
This decision marked the beginning of his lifelong rebellion against traditional religion. Instead, he devoted himself fully to philology, the study of ancient languages and texts. He was fascinated by Greek tragedy, Homer, and the cultural forces that shaped civilizations. His professors quickly recognized his genius. After a year, Nietzsche transferred to the University of Leipzig, where his intellectual life changed forever. There, he discovered the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, whose philosophy of a blind, irrational will to live struck Nietzsche like a thunderbolt. He later wrote, "I had before me a mirror in which I saw the world, life, and my own nature depicted with terrifying grandeur." At Leipzig, Nietzsche also encountered the writings of Friedrich Albert Lange, who introduced him to the new scientific worldview that challenged metaphysics and religion. Between Schopenhauer's dark vision and Lange's scientific clarity, Nietzsche's mind began forging the unique path that would later overturn both philosophy and morality. By his early 20s, Nietzsche was no longer just a student. He was already thinking like a radical philosopher. And soon, he would step into the academic world not as a learner, but as a professor, one of the youngest ever in Europe.
At just 24 years old, Nietzsche achieved something extraordinary. He was offered a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He hadn't even completed his doctorate, yet his brilliance was so undeniable that he was appointed directly. Arriving in Basel in 1869, Nietzsche quickly became known as a serious and unconventional thinker. His lectures often went beyond grammar and ancient texts. He explored the spirit of Greek tragedy, the clash between reason and passion, and the cultural forces shaping societies. His students saw in him not just a scholar, but a man searching for deeper truths. It was during this time that Nietzsche met the composer Richard Wagner, who became both a mentor and a friend. Wagner, already a towering figure in music, welcomed Nietzsche into his inner circle. For a while, Nietzsche idolized him, seeing Wagner as the modern heir of Greek tragedy, a genius who could revive culture through art. Their friendship would profoundly shape Nietzsche's early works. But Basel also marked the beginning of Nietzsche's struggles. His health, always fragile, worsened under the pressures of teaching and writing. Severe migraines, stomach pains, and eye problems tormented him, forcing him to spend weeks bedridden. Still, he pressed forward, pouring his strength into both scholarship and philosophy. In 1872, he published his first major book, The Birth of Tragedy. Bold, poetic, and controversial, it argued that Greek tragedy arose from the tension between two forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. With this daring work, Nietzsche announced himself as more than a philologist. He was a philosopher with a vision. The young professor had stepped into the battlefield of ideas, but as his reputation grew, so did the conflict that would define his life.
At first, Nietzsche saw Richard Wagner as a cultural savior, a man who could restore depth, passion, and myth to a Europe he believed was spiritually decaying. He even dedicated his early work, The Birth of Tragedy, to Wagner and Cosima, Wagner's wife. For a time, Nietzsche felt he had found both an artistic hero and a kind of surrogate family. But by the mid-1870s, cracks began to form. Nietzsche grew increasingly disillusioned with Wagner's circle. What he once admired as cultural renewal began to look, in his eyes, like nationalism, dogmatism, and even religious revival disguised as art. The final blow came when Nietzsche attended the first Bayreuth Festival in 1876, Wagner's grand showcase of his music dramas. Instead of a triumph of art, Nietzsche saw mass spectacle and shallow hero worship. He left feeling betrayed. To him, Wagner was no longer the liberator of culture, but another prophet of decadence. This break left Nietzsche isolated. His health deteriorated further, and in academia, his radical ideas were often dismissed. His colleagues viewed the birth of tragedy as speculative, unscientific, and too poetic for serious philology. He increasingly withdrew from university life, feeling alienated both from Wagner's world and from his fellow scholars. It was in this solitude that Nietzsche turned inward, sharpening his ideas and developing the philosophy that would make him infamous. He began writing a series of untimely meditations, essays that attacked the complacency of modern culture, the blind faith in progress, and the suffocating weight of history. His message was clear. Europe was heading toward a crisis of meaning, and only new daring thinkers could guide it. Nietzsche was preparing to become that voice, alone, uncompromising, and often misunderstood.
By 1879, Nietzsche's fragile health could no longer bear the demands of teaching. Blinding migraines, violent nausea, and failing eyesight left him incapacitated for weeks at a time. At only 34 years old, he resigned from his professorship at Basel, effectively ending his academic career. Yet this collapse marked the beginning of his most creative period. Free from academic constraints, Nietzsche lived as a wanderer, moving from town to town, chasing climates that might ease his pain. He spent time in the Swiss Alps, the Italian Riviera, and the German countryside, often living in modest boarding houses. He carried little with him, just his notebooks, a few clothes, and his determination to write. His days followed a rhythm shaped by illness. Mornings were often his only hours of clarity, when he could think and work before pain returned. Out of this suffering came some of his most explosive insights. In 1881, while walking in the Swiss village of Sils Maria, Nietzsche experienced what he later described as a lightning bolt revelation, the idea of the eternal recurrence, that every moment of life might return infinitely, over and over. This thought, terrifying and exhilarating, became central to his philosophy. During these wandering years, Nietzsche wrote works that broke away from his earlier style. Books like Human, All Too Human, and Daybreak revealed a sharper, more aphoristic voice. No longer Wagner's disciple, but a thinker carving his own path, questioning morality, truth, and the very foundations of human life. Ill and alone, Nietzsche transformed exile into power. His philosophy was no longer bound by tradition. It was becoming a radical reimagining of existence itself. Between 1883 and 1885, in the solitude of his wanderings, Nietzsche composed what would become his most famous and enigmatic work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It was unlike anything philosophy had seen before. Written not as a dry treatise, but as a poetic, almost biblical text, it told the story of Zarathustra, a prophet who descends from the mountains to share his wisdom with humanity. Through Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduced some of his most daring ideas. The central figure was the Übermensch, the overman or superman. Nietzsche envisioned this as the human being who rises above herd mentality, conventional morality, and mediocrity to create new values and affirm life with courage. It was not about power over others, but mastery over oneself, and the strength to shape existence. Another key theme was the death of God. Nietzsche declared that modern society had already killed its belief in the divine through science, reason, and skepticism. Yet humanity had not faced the consequences. Without God, old moral systems crumbled, leaving a terrifying emptiness. Zarathustra's task was to call for a new beginning, a re-evaluation of values to prevent despair and nihilism. The book baffled readers. Some saw it as poetry, others as madness. It sold poorly during Nietzsche's life, and even his closest friends struggled to grasp it. But Nietzsche himself considered Zarathustra his greatest achievement, the heart of his philosophy. He once wrote, "This book, with its voice of the heights and its wide wings, is not only the highest book that there is, but it is also the deepest, born out of the innermost abundance of truth." In Zarathustra, Nietzsche had poured his soul into a vision of what humanity could become, yet the world was not ready to listen.
After Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche sharpened his attack on the very foundations of human culture, morality itself. In books like Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, and On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, he argued that what we call morality is not eternal or absolute. Instead, it is a human invention, shaped by history, power, and resentment. Nietzsche drew a distinction between master morality and slave morality. Master morality, he said, arose from strong, noble individuals who affirmed life and valued qualities like strength, pride, and vitality. Slave morality, by contrast, was born from the weak and oppressed who, unable to act, redefined their weakness as good and condemned strength as evil. He saw Christianity as the ultimate form of slave morality, a system that exalted humility, obedience, and self-denial while demonizing strength, passion, and worldly joy. For Nietzsche, this inversion of values had led to Europe's decline, a culture weighted down by guilt, fear, and denial of life. His critique was not just an attack, but a call for renewal. Nietzsche urged humanity to move beyond good and evil, to transcend old moral categories and create new values rooted in strength, creativity, and affirmation. These ideas were radical, even scandalous. To many, Nietzsche seemed like a dangerous iconoclast tearing down the pillars of civilization. But to him, this destruction was necessary. Only by exposing the origins of morality could humanity free itself from chains and step toward new possibilities. In challenging morality itself, Nietzsche placed himself at the heart of philosophy's deepest battlefield, where few dared to go.
Nietzsche's rebellion did not stop at religion or morality. He went after truth itself. In works like Beyond Good and Evil and The Gay Science, he argued that what philosophers called truth was often nothing more than illusions, hardened into concepts and believed because they helped human beings survive. Truth, he said, was not an eternal divine reality, it was a human construction. He described language and concepts as metaphors that had been forgotten as metaphors. When we say something is true, we are really saying it fits into categories we invented long ago, categories that may have little to do with reality itself. For Nietzsche, truth was not sacred. It was a tool, often used by the powerful to impose order and control. This radical skepticism led him to challenge the entire history of philosophy. He accused thinkers from Plato to Kant of hiding behind systems and abstractions, creating illusions of stability in a chaotic world. Philosophy, in his eyes, was too often a defensive fear, a way to escape life rather than affirm it.
But Nietzsche was not a nihilist in the sense of despairing over this. Instead, he saw the death of absolute truth as an opportunity. If truth was a construction, then human beings had the power to create new meanings, new perspectives, new horizons. This idea paved the way for what he called perspectivism, the notion that there is no single absolute truth, only different perspectives, each revealing part of the world. By tearing down the idol of truth, Nietzsche freed philosophy to become something more dangerous, more honest, and more alive.
At the core of Nietzsche's later philosophy lies a bold and controversial idea, the will to power. For Nietzsche, life is not driven by survival alone, as Darwin claimed, nor by reason or morality, as philosophers insisted. Instead, all living beings are propelled by a deeper, more primal force, the drive to expand, to assert, to grow, to shape the world according to their strength. This he called the will to power. It was not about domination over others, as some later misinterpreted, but about self-overcoming, the inner push to transform weakness into strength, chaos into creation. Every act of art, every leap of ambition, every attempt to rise above limitation was for Nietzsche an expression of this fundamental will. He even saw truth, morality, and science as products of this will. Philosophers and priests, he argued, had invented their systems not because they discovered eternal laws, but because their will to power sought to impose meaning and order. In this vision, the universe itself is a vast field of competing wills, endlessly clashing and creating. There is no fixed order, no divine plan, only the ceaseless play of power. The will to power was Nietzsche's attempt to replace old metaphysical foundations with something raw and dynamic, a principle that embraced both struggle and creativity as the essence of life. It was daring, dangerous, and inspiring. For Nietzsche, to live fully meant not to deny this will, but to embrace it, to channel it, and to become more than what one is.
Nietzsche recognized a profound danger lurking in modernity: nihilism, the collapse of meaning. With the decline of religion, the old moral codes and sacred truths that had guided humanity for centuries were fading. But what would replace them? For Nietzsche, this was not a minor cultural shift, it was an existential crisis. If nothing has inherent value, if all is meaningless, why live at all? He distinguished between two forms of nihilism. Passive nihilism was the despairing kind, where people, overwhelmed by the loss of meaning, retreat into apathy, weakness, or escapism. This, Nietzsche warned, was the fate of many in a society that had lost faith but not yet found a new foundation. But there was also active nihilism, a powerful, dangerous force. Here, the destruction of old values became an opportunity for creation. By tearing down false idols, humanity could build something new, stronger, and more life-affirming. Nietzsche saw himself as standing at the frontier of this transformation. His mission was not to mourn the death of meaning, but to push humanity toward new values, born from strength and creativity rather than fear and submission. For him, nihilism was both a sickness and a cure. It revealed the fragility of human belief, but it also opened the door to a higher possibility, a future where individuals would forge their own values and embrace life without illusions. To Nietzsche, the question was not, is life meaningful? Rather, can you create meaning? Can you bear existence without escape?
Among Nietzsche's most mysterious and challenging ideas is the concept of the eternal return. He asks us to imagine this. What if one day a demon whispered in your ear, "This life, exactly as you are living it now, you must live again and again for all eternity. Every joy, every pain, every failure, every triumph, repeated endlessly with no change possible." For most people, this thought would be terrifying. To relive all your suffering forever might feel unbearable. But Nietzsche turned it into a test of strength. He called it the ultimate affirmation of life. If you could say yes to this thought, if you could embrace your life so fully that you would willingly relive it eternally, then you had achieved the highest form of existence. The eternal return was not about physics or cosmology. It was a spiritual challenge. It asked, do you love your life enough to live it over and over? If not, what must you change to make it worth affirming? For Nietzsche, this idea was like a hammer striking against the soul. It forced one to confront whether they were truly living authentically or merely drifting through life. The strongest spirit, the Übermensch, would not recoil at the thought of eternal return. Instead, they would welcome it with joy, saying, "Yes, I want this life just as it is forever." It was Nietzsche's ultimate test of courage, a call to love existence so deeply that even its darkest hours become something you would choose again.
If there's one concept that threads through all of Nietzsche's work, it is the will to power. Unlike earlier philosophers who believed that life was driven by the search for pleasure, survival, or reason, Nietzsche claimed that at the root of all living beings lies a deeper force, the will to expand, to overcome, to grow stronger, to impose form upon chaos. The will to power is not just about domination over others, it is about self-overcoming. A plant pushing through concrete to reach the sun, an artist creating something new out of nothing, a thinker challenging the deepest assumptions of society, all are expressions of this will. For Nietzsche, life itself was not about comfort, equality, or safety. It was about struggle, creation, and the drive to transform. Every great achievement, he argued, was born not from mere survival, but from this unceasing striving to become more than what one is. In human beings, the will to power manifests in countless forms: ambition, creativity, curiosity, even love. But when suppressed, it can also turn destructive: resentment, bitterness, and the craving to pull others down. Nietzsche believed that to truly live, one must channel this force, consciously, not deny it, not hide it, but embrace it as the very essence of existence. To him, the will to power was the engine of life itself, the eternal drive that pushes humanity forward, shaping culture, morality, and destiny.
Nietzsche shook the foundations of Western thought with his critique of morality. He argued that what we commonly call morality was not universal truth. It was a human invention shaped by power struggles, resentment, and cultural needs. He made a famous distinction between master morality and slave morality. Master morality, he said, was the morality of the strong, the noble, the life-affirming. It valued strength, courage, beauty, vitality, and the pursuit of excellence. For the masters, good was everything that expressed power and greatness, while bad was weakness, cowardice, or mediocrity. Slave morality, on the other hand, was born out of resentment, the collective feelings of the oppressed, the powerless, the downtrodden. Instead of celebrating strength, it glorified humility, obedience, meekness, and equality. It redefined weakness as good and strength as evil. Nietzsche believed that much of Western morality, especially Christian ethics, grew out of this slave morality. It served the weak by taming the strong, making the powerful feel guilty for their vitality and instincts. But for Nietzsche, this moral system was dangerous. It suppressed life's natural instincts, leading to guilt, self-denial, and conformity. He called this the morality of the herd. He did not argue for cruelty or oppression, but for a re-evaluation of values, a morality that would affirm life, encourage creativity, and allow humanity to grow beyond guilt and fear. Nietzsche's challenge was radical. If morality is not eternal truth, but a creation of human history, then we are free and responsible to create new values.
One of Nietzsche's earliest and most influential works was The Birth of Tragedy, 1872. In it, he explored the origins of Greek tragedy and introduced two powerful forces that he believed shaped not only art, but human existence itself: the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian represented order, logic, clarity, harmony, and reason. Named after the god Apollo, it symbolized the world of form, boundaries, and rational thought. It gave structure to life, allowing humans to create beauty through control and measure. The Dionysian, named after the god Dionysus, embodied chaos, passion, intoxication, instinct, and the wildness of nature. It was the primal, emotional, ecstatic side of life, where individuality dissolved into unity with the whole of existence. Nietzsche argued that the greatness of Greek tragedy came from the fusion of these two forces, the balance between the disciplined Apollonian and the ecstatic Dionysian. Together, they created art that was not only beautiful, but deeply meaningful, capable of expressing the full complexity of human experience. But Nietzsche believed that over time, Western culture lost the Dionysian spirit. Philosophy, science, and rationality, shaped by Socratic and later Christian thought, suppressed chaos and passion in favor of rigid order. The result, he argued, was a culture that was incomplete, one-sided, and sickly. For Nietzsche, true art and true life required a reconciliation of both forces, the clarity of Apollo and the wildness of Dionysus. Only by embracing both reason and instinct could humanity rise to new heights of creativity and vitality. This vision would remain central to Nietzsche's philosophy. Life was not about choosing one over the other, but about holding opposites in tension: order and chaos, logic and passion, restraint and freedom.
Among Nietzsche's most haunting and provocative ideas was the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence. He asked, what if you had to live your exact same life, with every joy, every mistake, every pain, and every triumph, over and over again, for eternity? This was not meant as a literal cosmological theory, but as a test of one's attitude toward life. If the idea filled you with dread, it revealed that you were living in a way you did not truly embrace. But if you could welcome it, if you could say yes to reliving every moment endlessly, it meant you had achieved a deep affirmation of existence. Nietzsche saw the eternal recurrence as the ultimate measure of strength and authenticity. To live as though you would gladly repeat your life forever was to live without regret, to embrace both suffering and joy as essential to existence. He wanted people to move beyond resentment, beyond wishing life were different, and instead to say, amor fati, the love of one's fate. Not just accepting life as it is,
but loving it with all its chaos and pain. The eternal recurrence was a challenge. Can you live so fully, so courageously, that you would welcome living this same life for eternity? It was Nietzsche's radical call to confront life head-on, to embrace it completely, and to transform suffering into strength.
Nietzsche's brilliance was shadowed by relentless suffering. From his youth, he was plagued by migraines, failing eyesight, nausea, and exhaustion. Some scholars believe he may have had a neurological disorder. Others suggest syphilis or even a tumor. Whatever the cause, his physical decline was constant, yet it never silenced his writing. He lived much of his adult life as a solitary wanderer, moving from town to town in Switzerland, Italy, and France, searching for climates that might ease his pain. Despite his isolation, these were his most productive years, during which he wrote his greatest works. But in January 1889, Nietzsche's life collapsed into tragedy. In Turin, he witnessed a horse being whipped by its owner. According to legend, Nietzsche rushed forward, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and collapsed in tears. Soon after, he broke down completely, entering a state of madness from which he would never recover. His letters from this period, known as the Madness Letters, were wild and incoherent, sometimes signing them Dionysius or even the Crucified. Friends and family realized his mind was gone. Nietzsche spent the final 11 years of his life under the care of his mother and later his sister Elisabeth, completely incapacitated, unable to write, lost to the world that once shook under the force of his words. This tragic end gave rise to the myth of Nietzsche as the mad prophet, a genius consumed by the very fire of his philosophy.
After Nietzsche's collapse, his sister, Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche, assumed control over his unpublished writings and legacy. But Elisabeth had a very different worldview than her brother. She was a devoted nationalist, anti-Semite, and supporter of authoritarian ideologies, views Nietzsche had fiercely opposed during his lifetime. Elisabeth carefully edited, rearranged, and even altered Nietzsche's notes, creating a posthumous book called The Will to Power. While Nietzsche had indeed used the phrase in his philosophy, he never wrote the book as she presented it. By reshaping his ideas, Elisabeth made them appear to align with her own political agenda. This manipulation had lasting consequences. In the early 20th century, Nietzsche's writings, distorted through Elisabeth's edits, were embraced by German nationalists and later misused by the Nazi regime, which twisted his philosophy to justify their ideology. But this was a betrayal of Nietzsche's thought. He had despised anti-Semitism, nationalism, and herd mentality. He believed in the liberation of the individual, not in submission to the state or race-based ideologies. It took decades of careful scholarship to separate Nietzsche's authentic writings from Elisabeth's distortions. Today, we know his philosophy was far more nuanced, complex, and opposed to the ideas she tried to attach to his name. Elisabeth's influence turned Nietzsche into a misunderstood and controversial figure for generations. Only in recent times has his true voice begun to be heard again.
Despite the distortions of his work, Nietzsche's true philosophy eventually resurfaced and began to influence nearly every corner of modern intellectual life. In philosophy, his challenge to absolute truths and his exposure of hidden motives behind morality paved the way for existentialism and postmodernism. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Michel Foucault all acknowledged their debt to Nietzsche. In psychology, Nietzsche anticipated ideas that Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung would later develop. His exploration of the unconscious drives, repression, and the will to power
foreshadowed the foundations of psychoanalysis. In literature and art, Nietzsche inspired writers like Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, and Thomas Mann, as well as artists, poets, and musicians who saw in him a prophet of creativity and rebellion against convention. Even in politics and culture, Nietzsche's critique of herd mentality and his call for the individual to rise above mass conformity continue to resonate. His philosophy challenges people to confront life's harshest truths without illusions and to create meaning for themselves in a world without guarantees. Though controversial, Nietzsche's influence is undeniable. He became the philosopher who not only predicted the cultural crises of the 20th century, but also offered tools to face them. His words still echo, "The world must be reinvented, and each person must become the author of their own destiny."
Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900, the dawn of a new century that would unfold much as he predicted. Wars, revolutions, the decline of old religions, and the rise of new ideologies. Though he passed away in silence, his ideas exploded across the modern world. Nietzsche left behind no system, no final doctrine, only fragments, aphorisms, and challenges. But it was precisely this openness that made his philosophy timeless. He did not tell people what to think, he demanded that they think for themselves. His warnings about nihilism, the danger of a world without shared values, proved prophetic. In the 20th century, humanity faced exactly the crisis he foresaw: the collapse of old certainties, the horrors of world wars, and the struggle to find meaning in an age of science, technology, and doubt. Yet Nietzsche also offered a vision of hope. Through concepts like the Übermensch, Eternal Recurrence, and Amor Fati, he encouraged people not to despair, but to embrace life as a creative challenge. He wanted us to transform suffering into strength, chaos into art, and despair into affirmation. Today, Nietzsche stands as a prophet of the modern age, misunderstood by some, revered by others, but impossible to ignore. His philosophy remains alive because it asks the most radical question of all: what will you create when there are no absolutes left to guide you? Nietzsche's legacy is not an answer, it is a call to courage, creativity, and the deepest affirmation of life itself.
He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. That which does not kill us makes us stronger. Without music, life would be a mistake. There are no facts, only interpretations. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. The man of knowledge must be able not only to love his enemies, but also to hate his friends. In heaven, all the interesting people are missing. There is always some madness in love, but there is also always some reason in madness. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Sometimes, people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. No artist tolerates reality. To live is to suffer. To be alive is to find meaning in the suffering. You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. I am not a man, I am dynamite. In every real man, a child is hidden that wants to play. The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die. As well, The minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind. Man is the cruelest animal. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star.